All right, let's talk about the era of Reconstruction. I mean, think about it. In just 12 years, one president was assassinated, another one got impeached, and the very definition of what it means to be an American citizen was completely rewritten. So, the big question we're going to tackle, the one you'll definitely see on your exam, is this. After a war that tore the country apart, what did it actually take to try and put the United States back together? This period was just full of these huge contradictions. On one hand, you have incredible hope, but on the other, just a brutal, violent backlash. It was a clash of ideas that honestly shaped the next 100 years of American history. Okay, let's get into it. All right, here's how we'll break it down. First, the presidential plans. Then we'll see how Congress took control. After that, radical Reconstruction in action. And finally, we'll look at the collapse of the whole thing. Okay, first up, the presidential plans. This is all about Lincoln, his successor Johnson, and how their first steps kind of set the stage for all the drama that came later. So, what was Lincoln's #1 goal? It was simple. Get the country back together. He wanted to reunify the nation as quickly and as painlessly as he could. Leniency was the name of his game. So Lincoln comes up with this 10% plan, which was pretty lenient. But Congress, they had a much tougher idea. Their Wade Davis bill said a majority of voters had to swear this ironclad oath that they had never supported the Confederacy. I mean, that's a huge difference, right? Lincoln thought it was way too harsh, so he vetoed it. And the guys in Congress pushing for this harsher plan, they had a name, the Radical Republicans. For them, Lincoln's plan was just letting traitors off the hook. They didn't just want to reunify, they wanted to totally tear down and rebuild Southern society from scratch. But, for all their fighting, Lincoln and the Radicals did agree on one absolutely critical thing. They had to pass the 13th Amendment. This was the big one. It would permanently, once and for all, abolish slavery in the United States. And it was ratified in December of 1865. Tragically, Lincoln never got to see that happen. His assassination just changed everything. Suddenly, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, is in the Oval Office. And Johnson, a Southerner himself, starts handing out pardons to former Confederates. And then, and this just stunned Congress, by the end of 1865, he basically says, all right, we're done here. Reconstruction is complete. So, remember this key point. This early period was a total battle between the president's soft approach and Congress's much tougher goals. You've got the president saying mission accomplished, while Congress is thinking the real fight hasn't even started. Okay, so Congress looks at what Johnson's done and says absolutely not. They completely refuse to accept his version of a restored South. Instead, they grab the reins and start their own plan to rebuild the South. And a huge piece of their plan was something called the Freedmen's Bureau. I mean, think about what this agency did. It was set up to help millions of newly freed African Americans. It provided food, set up public schools, some of which became famous universities. It helped negotiate labor contracts, and even worked to reunite families that had been ripped apart by slavery. A massive undertaking. But how did the South react? Well, in total defiance, Southern states started passing these things called black codes. These were basically laws designed to recreate slavery in all but name. So, quick recall. What did the black codes do? They used things like super restrictive labor contracts to pretty much chain freed people back to the land they'd just been freed from. Well, Congress wasn't having it. To fight back against these black codes and against President Johnson, who was doing nothing, they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And then they took an even bigger step. They drafted the 14th Amendment. And look, the 14th Amendment, this was a game changer. You could argue it was the most important change to the Constitution since the Bill of Rights itself. Why? Because it did two revolutionary things. First, it said anyone born in the U.S. is a citizen, period. That included the millions of formerly enslaved people. And second, it guaranteed every single citizen equal protection under the law. This was a direct shot at the horrible Dred Scott decision. So the big takeaway here is this. Congress fought back against President Johnson's leniency with everything it had. It used federal agencies, and most importantly, it changed the Constitution itself. All right, now Congress is firmly in the driver's seat. They're overriding Johnson's vetoes, and the radical Republicans are ready to launch their most ambitious plan yet. This is Radical Reconstruction in action. So what did they do? They passed the Reconstruction Acts of 1867. This basically put the South under military rule. I mean, they carved the old Confederacy into 5 military districts, put a Union general in charge of each one, and sent in troops to enforce the law and protect freed people.
Of course, President Johnson is fighting them every step of the way, but then he makes a huge mistake. He fires his Secretary of War, which was against a new law called the Tenure of Office Act. And that was it. The House had had enough, and they voted to impeach him. Now, he wasn't removed from office, he was acquitted by just one single vote in the Senate, but his presidency was effectively over.
So, after the election of 1868, war hero Ulysses S. Grant is president. And with a Republican in the White House, Congress has the political power to pass one last major Reconstruction amendment.
And that was the 15th Amendment. Its purpose was simple but powerful. It said the right to vote cannot be denied because of a person's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In other words, it granted Black men the vote.
Now, this was an incredible victory, for sure, but it was also a source of deep disappointment for women's suffrage activists. People like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had been right there in the fight against slavery, but the amendment's language left women out completely. It actually caused a really painful split in the civil rights movement.
But the impact for Black men was immediate and historic. For the very first time, you see Black men being elected to all levels of government, local, state, and even the U.S. Senate, like Hiram Revels from Mississippi. So, quick check. What did the 15th Amendment guarantee? It guaranteed the right to vote for all men, no matter their race, which opened the door to this incredible wave of political participation. So, let's remember the key takeaway for this phase. Radical Reconstruction used military force and brand new amendments to totally reshape Southern politics. This was really the high point of the federal government's attempt to build a real, working, interracial democracy. But all of this progress, it didn't go unanswered. It triggered a violent, brutal counter-revolution in the South. And when you combine that with the fact that the North was starting to lose its will to fight, well, the whole era came to a tragic end. So, let's start with the economy. For most formerly enslaved people, there was really only one option: sharecropping. Basically, they'd rent a plot of land, usually from their old master, and pay for it with a huge share of the crops they grew. It sounds okay, but it almost always trapped them in a cycle of debt they could never escape. And at the exact same time, you have the rise of terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Let's be clear about what they were. They used terror, arson, beatings, murder to stop Reconstruction cold and bring back white supremacy. Just listen to this testimony from Abram Colby, who was an elected Black legislator in Georgia. It shows you the absolute horror they were up against. And then you have the political side of this backlash. A group of Southern Democrats called themselves Redeemers, and their goal was to overthrow the new Republican governments by any means necessary to restore what they called white rule. So it's a key question: what led to the end of Reconstruction? The truth is, it wasn't just one thing. It was this perfect storm of violent resistance in the South, a huge economic depression in 1873, a bunch of scandals in the Grant administration, and honestly, a North that was just tired of the whole thing. And the final nail in the coffin, that would be the Compromise of 1877. You had this crazy disputed presidential election. So a backroom deal gets made. The Republicans get to have their guy, Rutherford B. Hayes, be president. And what do the Democrats get in return? The Republicans agree to pull all the remaining federal troops out of the South. And that's the key takeaway here. Reconstruction collapses because of that violent opposition, because the North lost interest, and because of this final political deal. Pulling those troops out meant it was over. Okay, that was a lot, I know. It's one of the most complicated times in U.S. history. So let's do a quick rapid-fire review of the key facts you absolutely have to know. First, Lincoln's main goal was to reunify the country, and he wanted to be lenient. The 13th Amendment in 1865, it abolished slavery for good. The 14th in 1868, it granted citizenship and equal protection. And the 15th in 1870, it gave Black men the right to vote. Remember, the Southern Black Codes are what led to federal action. The sharecropping system trapped many free people in debt. The KKK used terror to undermine everything. And finally, the Compromise of 1877 was the deal that ended it all by removing federal troops. So, in the end, Reconstruction failed to create a lasting interracial democracy.
It gave us 3 of the most important amendments to the Constitution, but it couldn't protect those rights for the people it was meant to help. And that leaves us with a really important question. What can we learn from its failure? The fight over that legacy would go on for another 100 years. Thanks for joining me.